Fractional reserve banking is when banks only keep a small percentage of deposits on hand, as is the case with banks in the United States and most of them around the world. The alternative is full reserve banking, which is when a bank keeps all the deposits on hand and is essentially just a safekeeper of your money. If you had a piggy bank as a kid, it was likely operating as a full reserve bank, unless it was coming to life like in Toy Story or something and making loans with your deposits of coins. Fractional reserve banking has important implications for the supply of money and the stability of the financial system. When you deposit money at a bank, they only keep a fraction of it in their reserves, and they use the rest to make loans. For example, a bank might only keep 10% of a customer's deposits in reserve. When you spend money from your account or withdraw it as cash, the bank gives you money out of those reserves. And since normally a bank sees a steady stream of deposits, keeping just 10% is plenty to handle the spending and withdrawals their customers typically do. But consider what happens to the other 90% of your money, which the bank uses to make loans. If the bank loans the money to an entrepreneur who is starting a new business, that entrepreneur is likely to spend it on the capital they need, which means the money ends up in someone's pocket. And that person is likely to deposit it in a bank, which will then keep a fraction of it and lend out the rest. That is, the loan becomes a deposit, which becomes another loan, which becomes another deposit, and on the cycle goes. Let's walk through this with an example and some numbers. Let's say you deposit $10,000 into Bank A. That bank typically would have a policy about what percentage they would keep in reserve, which we'll call the reserve ratio. If a bank keeps 10% of all deposits in reserves, then their reserve ratio is 10%. So Bank A would split that $10,000 deposit up. They would keep $1,000, 10% of $10,000, in reserve, and they would use the remaining $9,000 to make loans. To make things easy, let's assume they use all $9,000 for one loan. In the real world, that money is likely to end up all over the place, but let's say that the $9,000 is used to pay a single contractor, and that contractor deposits the money into Bank B. Now, Bank B just got a $9,000 deposit. If they also have a reserve ratio of 10%, they will keep $900 in reserves and lend out the other $8,100, which might end up in Bank C. Let's take stock of our situation so far. Right now, we have 3 people with money. You deposited the original $10,000. Then there's this contractor who banks at Bank B who has another $9,000 in their account, and someone else who deposited $8,100 into Bank C. If we go around and ask people how much money they have, we'll get a total of $27,100, or $10,000 plus $9,000 plus $8,100. Through this process of lending, the banks have actually created money and increased the money supply in the economy. And it won't end there. Bank C will keep $810 in reserves and lend out the remaining $7,290. When that lands in Bank D, they will keep $729 and lend out $6,561. And now our money supply is up to $40,951. We could keep doing this to infinity, adding a little more to our money supply each time. But luckily, there's a little math shortcut that we can take to find out the grand total of how much money there will be. The Money Multiplier is 1 over R, which is the reserve ratio. If banks keep 10% of deposits in reserve, then R would be 0.1, which is the decimal form of 10%. 1 divided by 0.1 is equal to 10, which is our money multiplier. For every new dollar deposited in a bank, the money supply will increase by $10. So your initial deposit of $10,000 will result in an additional $90,000 created through the process of lending, for a total of $100,000, or 10,000 times 10, our money multiplier. Since banks would generally keep 10 to 20% of deposits in reserve, you can see how the creation of a little bit of new money could result in a big increase in the money supply, and vice versa. If a bit of money disappears, the money supply could shrink significantly. In the days of the gold standard, this could happen often, with the discovery of new gold deposits or the movement of gold out of the US. And with the Federal Reserve now empowered to print money, they needed to have control over this ratio in order to properly regulate the supply of money. And so, the first important tool that the Fed has to influence the money supply is the required reserve ratio. The Federal Reserve has the power to set a minimum reserve ratio that all banks must adhere to. This not only helps ensure that banks keep a large enough fraction to handle a potential run where lots of depositors demand their money back, but also allows the Fed to keep control of the money multiplier. When the Federal Reserve raises the required reserve ratio, they shrink the money multiplier and therefore shrink the money supply. Likewise, when the Fed lowers the required reserve ratio, they magnify the money multiplier and increase the money supply. If you remember the video about recessions, one problem was that recessions kicked off a deflationary spiral where prices fell, making it difficult for businesses to earn sufficient revenues to keep their workers employed and pay back loans. Combined with their monopoly over the printing of money, these regulatory powers over banks gave the Fed control over the nation's supply of money, allowing them to keep the quantity of money stable, which should then keep prices stable in line with their legal mandate.